Hello and welcome to Infrastructure Matters, the podcast dedicated to exploring the critical world of infrastructure, asset management and public works. I'm your host, David Jenkins, the CEO of IPWEA. In today's episode, we're joined by Chris Lecluse, the Queensland State Manager at Teletrac Navman. From his early career in the police force to becoming a leading voice in telematics, Chris brings a powerful perspective on road safety, driver education, and technology-driven transformation. We'll explore how AI, video telematics, and change management strategies are reshaping fleet safety, and how organizations can use data to coach rather than punish. So sit back and join us for this insightful conversation. Welcome to Infrastructure Matters podcast. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Chris Lecluse, who's the Queensland State Manager for Teletrac Navman. Now, we've just been talking, Chris, and I think it's really interesting, your background. So you came from a slightly different background and then you've been 11 years at Teletrac Navman, but can you just give the audience a bit about what you did previously?
Yes, I was a police officer at the West Australian Police Force, started basically out of school, and that's really where I formed my career. After 20 years, I was a sergeant. Much of my time in the police force was dedicated to highway patrol, crash investigations, police driver training, so all things vehicle related.
So you moved from the police force into Teletrac Navman. Now, what was the reason for that?
I had been working offline from the police as a external contractor for the oil and gas industry in the Middle East as a driver trainer.
Yeah, right.
And as part of that linked with telematics.
Yeah. And
eventually I got offered a position to go and exercise those skills in the United States. So I went there for 5 years. And that was my first foray full-time into the telematics market. And that's when I really understood the power of the technology in making drivers safer and enabling fleets to operate in a safer environment.
But many of your colleagues would have probably stayed in the police force, but for you, and just talking before, there's a strong sort of values, ethical thing around safety, isn't it? That comes through, just in our conversation, that comes through very strongly. So that resonates then why you would make this move, because you see this basic, the solution with Teletrac Navman is around safety and the importance of safety, because you've been on the other end of it when you've seen that things, when they've gone very, very wrong, obviously.
Yeah, so having been that crash investigator and dealt with road trauma, road fatalities, having seen the effect it has, the devastation it creates, not only for families but organisations and communities, when I saw what the technology of telematics was and how it could enable a safer outcome for drivers, it became clear to me. So it wasn't as if there was a job opportunity that I saw and I applied for and I thought, let's just try that out. For me, if there was not an outcome that was aligned to my ethical principles, then I couldn't do it. And I found that it has been the case, which is why I've been with the industry for so long now.
And how have you seen it change? Because you said you've been 11 years. How have you seen the technology move and change? And then maybe give the audience a bit of an insight into what Teletrac Navman's done to keep pace with that.
I think in the early days when I entered telematics, it was still in its fairly infant state.
Yeah.
Now, what that means is that a lot of organisations would negotiate with the tech companies such as ourselves at an elevated level, which meant the executive leadership team who signed the checks essentially to purchase the technology negotiated with our sales teams.
Yeah.
The missing piece were the end users, the drivers, and often the drivers felt excluded from the process.
Yeah.
And they had to make up their own mind as to what this technology was. Because they weren't consulted in the first place, their minds constantly went to that pessimistic perspective that this is Big Brother, it's just an opportunity for the organisation to spy on me. So there was a great deal of resistance from drivers representatives and unions. So early on in my years at Teletrac Navman, I spent quite a considerable amount of time researching the objections from the drivers and the unions, understanding the root cause behind that, and then devising a plan as to how we can better consult with the drivers, bring them into the process and get their genuine feelings as to what their concerns were. Often their concerns were built on myths, and breaking down those myths, talking to the drivers gave them a sense of inclusion. And when you include the drivers in that result, they're much more likely to adopt the technology and see the benefits rather than the negatives.
It's easier said than done, because you're essentially changing behaviours, thinking, and you've highlighted how you've done that and sort of talking through the stories, but what are the different communication channels that you used and your team used to convince unions, convince drivers? How did you, it's the mechanics of it. I'm interested in that.
Sure. So when we figured out that objection protocol existed with the drivers, I thought about how do we break down those barriers. So when I went to the organisations, I proposed what we call driver education forums. Now, I'm fortunate enough through my law enforcement background to have been exposed to legislation, to investigations, to prosecutions, the court processes, etc. So I almost reverse engineer, should an incident or a collision occur, what will that mean to the driver? What will that mean to the organisation? What will that mean for any prosecutions?
Yeah.
And over the years, the governments have introduced a variety of levels of control measures.
Yeah.
So one of those is, for instance, chain of responsibility legislation for the heavy vehicle national law. So what I did was, with these driver education forums, they were deliberately designed to engage directly with the drivers prior to the implementation of any telematics program, so that they could get an understanding as what this meant. It's all part of what we call the change management principle. Humans are hardwired to resist change. So anytime you introduce, because we work on a routine system, we as people, as workers, we develop a routine around our work environment to ensure that we do our work as efficiently as possible. And that becomes muscle memory. Yeah. And therefore, when you start to introduce that change, that creates anxiety and stress within the drivers.
Yeah.
So the change management process included these driver education forums to give those drivers an outlet, to give them an opportunity to ask, what does this mean to me? So when we do the driver education forums, they're never done in a set format. We don't turn up with a PowerPoint presentation or a set boundary of rule sets. We just go in there and we say, we're installing, or the organisation is looking to install this technology for your benefit, but we understand that this causes some anxiety. So what are those anxieties for you? And they would then explain to us what their hesitations are.
Yep.
And I go back and explain to them what the legal status is, what the protections are built into the system for them as drivers. And the big one is the why, the question of why we're implementing the technology. So that could be everything from the requirement of the organisation to meet their compliance requirements legislatively.
Yep.
But ultimately it boils down to the safety of the drivers.
And just for those people that don't know, just maybe high level, give an insight into the technology that sits behind Teletrac Navman. What are the technologies that you employ to increase safety, just at a high level?
At a high level, it simply is that with telematics, it gives the organisation an opportunity to see on a computer screen with a map where their vehicles, where their fleet are, geographically, obviously, importantly, how the vehicles are being used. And while that the realisation of efficiencies is inbuilt in that, from a safety perspective, we can see how those drivers are operating those pieces of machinery or vehicles. We know that 2/3 of all workplace fatalities occur in or around a vehicle.
Yeah.
So when we balance that with the workplace health and safety legislation, there are really two key elements to that legislation, and that is the requirement for an organisation to demonstrate their proactivity in the identification of the risk.
Yeah.
And we know at a high level what that means, because statistically those 2/3 of workplace fatalities occur in or around the vehicles. The second part's more difficult to get your head around, and that is the requirement for an organisation to demonstrate proactivity, how they've mitigated those identified risks. So what telematics does is afford the organisation an opportunity to distill down to quite a granular level where their high-risk drivers are, who they are, and what makes them high-risk drivers. We know that for professional drivers, if that is your income, you're almost never going to admit the fact, whether you know it or not, that you're a poor driver, that you demonstrate poor driving behaviours. So with telematics, it's binary, it's data. So we can demonstrate to the driver where their deficiencies lie and use that data to coach them into being part of that mitigation process.
And I guess that comes back to the whole change management process, because it's about coaching, so we've identified there's some issues here. Here's the data. You can't argue with it. But we're here to help you. Is that those are the sorts of conversations that you have? Yeah.
That is. And because it is data, it's irrefutable.
Yeah.
So where a driver, and this is a really important part, a lot of people drive based off of muscle memory.
Yeah.
So very few, even professional drivers, have had no formal driver training beyond getting their license. So as a learner, they go through the process, they get their P plates, and then they learn based off of what they encounter on the road. So there's no formal driver training beyond that. So we ask, what is your measure? How do you measure yourself as a good driver? And often the answers we get are, I haven't had a collision, or I've not had many speeding tickets. But the reality is, we know through the data that most drivers don't do the right thing.
Yeah.
Now, it's the degree to which and the frequency with which they don't do the right thing which contributes to their score. So when you present that data to the drivers, they're often shocked because what they do in their normal day-to-day, because they reach their destination often without adverse consequences, they believe they are a good driver.
Yeah.
But that's not realised by law. So I often ask them, when you do exceed the speed limit by 5 kilometres per hour, or you roll through that stop sign, or you follow somebody too close, how do you justify that mentally to yourself?
Yeah.
What do you say to yourself?
Yeah.
So they're the sorts of things that we use
confronting.
to turn it around and then say to them, well, the data suggests that these are areas for you to improve. And that gives the organisation an opportunity to open that conversation with that driver. We don't want to use that data. We strongly suggest to our clients that they don't use the data to dismiss their personnel, but use it for coaching purposes.
Yeah, okay. If we were to sit down in, say, 5 years' time, right, you and me, and we would where the whole telematics industry is going, can you give me some insights? I'm asking you to look at a crystal ball here, I know, but you'll be thinking about this, right? You'll be thinking about this because the technology moves so quickly. So where do you think it's all going to go?
Look, I think we're at a tipping point at the moment with video telematics, and in particular AI video telematics.
Yeah.
It's a very powerful tool, and we're starting to see how powerful that is at the moment. It's really taking the telematics industry forward in leaps and bounds. So I think video telematics will be extremely prevalent throughout most fleets. The challenge we're having at the moment is with the AI cameras, the lenses can point forward out of the cabin.
Yeah. They
can point towards the rear of the vehicle, and they can point towards the sides. The challenge we're having is where the cameras point towards the drivers.
Yeah.
And it makes sense as to why drivers would be concerned having a camera lens trained on them while they're driving.
Yes.
So that's a conversation that we're actively having with most drivers at the moment. What we do know, because it is maturing, with organisations that have been early adopters of the video telematics, most fleet managers in those organisations, up to 73% of those, have responded with the outcome has been positive for them as an organisation and their drivers once they overcome that objection. But we still need to get the message across to the drivers that this is not a technology that is designed to be punitive against them. It is designed wholly for their safety, so that we can corroborate. What we know is most professional drivers overwhelmingly do the right thing almost all of the time. So what the cameras do is often corroborate their version of events where an incident occurs. So we're starting to see that, and that's why those fleet managers have such a high incidence of approval for those video telematics.
Now, forgive my ignorance, but I understand the whole concept of video telematics, but you said the importance of AI. How is AI playing a new role? What's it doing? I'm assuming it's interpreting the data far quicker. How does that work? Just practically.
Yeah, that's a great question. So a lot of people will be familiar with dash cams.
Yeah.
Now, traditional consumer dash cam simply records the environment in which the vehicle is being operated. What AI does is it has a powerful engine, a powerful algorithm built in, and what that does is it has the ability to read things such as street signs, speed limits, stop signs, distance following to the vehicle ahead. So what it does is it puts a great deal of context around what the driving environment looks like.
Yeah.
prior to video telematics, we had just the binary telematics. So from a report, you could see a location of a vehicle. We could measure things such as harsh acceleration, harsh deceleration, harsh cornering, overspeeding. But that was about the limit of what we could measure. But now with video telematics and AI in particular, it just increases the bandwidth with which we can modulate the environment. And then it gives us a great more detail around what the driver is doing.
It's a balancing act though, isn't it? Because the technology is moving on so quickly, and yet, as you've said, it's so much about driver education. It's confronting, but positioning it the way you position it around, it's coaching it. I mean, that's that constant balance. And obviously you want to keep ahead of the competitors. So how do you keep, as an organization, balancing all those three things, the moving technology, staying ahead of the competition, and yet keeping your end user, your drivers across it all? How do you manage that?
Let me start with keeping the end user across what's happening. Once again, that's the change management piece.
Yeah.
If you get that right, that removes those roadblocks. So appeasing the drivers, appeasing the unions to help them understand that we look at the technology, we look at the AI cameras as a form of PPE. If we wind the clock back 30 years and look at what drivers, even people on construction sites, used to wear on those construction sites, it was a blue singlet, a pair of shorts and some flip-flops, and they were building a brick wall, for instance. So people of today in those industries look back and they just scratch their head and wonder, how did they ever get away with that? Yeah. So over a period of time, we're constantly evolving and constantly introducing new forms of PPE to keep the worker safe. And that's how I see telematics. Telematics is always moving forward, and it's part of the PPE program for an organisation to keep the drivers safe. Balancing that with the operational needs of the organisation, it comes with a cost, but often that cost is neutralised through the benefits that safer driving realises through consumables like tyres, brakes, suspension, obviously collisions and harm to people. So that's largely mitigated through those soft costings. But, how do we stay ahead of our competitors? Because it is a competitive market. So it's through having specialists like myself within the organisation. We do see other operators, and many telematics operators are very good at what they do. And I'm not here to, say anything negative about them, but I do know that within Teletrack Navman, we spend an awful lot in research and development in the tech side of things, but we also recognise the power of having the right people to respond to the right industries. So we've got specialists for the transport industry. We've got specialists for the construction industry. We've got specialists in the workplace health and safety environment, such as myself. So having that knowledge base within the organisation to assist the customers is a very powerful tool.
Yeah, okay. Now, you've been long-term supporters of the Fleet Conference, and for that, we thank you very much. What are some of the conversations, because we've got fleet managers here from right across Australia, managing quite big fleets, local government typically. What are some of the conversations that you've had? What are some of these fleet managers asking you? I'm quite interested in that.
I've been fortunate enough to be coming to the IPWEA for about a decade now. And when I look back at when I first got here, they were just asking, what is telematics and how does it work? And, this is, how do I get it into my fleets? Now, most of them have it. Most of the local governments have telematics. A lot of them are our customers, and they are big fleets. The difficulty with local government in particular is that they have a very diverse fleet. If you consider a transport operator, they may have 50 trucks, but they're all the same type of vehicle. But within the local government space, they have everything from a chainsaw up to a bulldozer, etc. So, and everything in between. So the type of technology required for each of those pieces of assets, it differs greatly. So the conversation is, what technologies have you got specifically to meet my diverse fleet? And how does that help me with both my financial position, but also my compliance with safety?
Yeah, okay. And having been here for the last couple of days, is there anything that you sort of surprised you, or anything that you sort of could take away and go, well, that was interesting, didn't thought about that, or something I could take away, or my team could take away, or Teletrack Navman could take away from this?
I think listening to some of the presentations, it's clear that the fleet space is changing inherently.
Yeah.
For the longest time, they were internal combustion engine vehicles, and that's been a known quantity. It hasn't changed, significantly over the last 50 years.
Yeah.
But over the last 5 years, there's been the intense push by governments to introduce EVs.
Yep.
I think that's neutralised to a degree for the time being, because we're seeing the proliferation, if you will, of plug-in hybrid vehicles.
Mm-hmm.
These new vehicle technologies are causing some concern and some consternation within the fleet managers, because once again, it's change.
Yeah.
They've developed their processes and their protocols around ICE vehicles for a very long time, and they work. But now we're having to look at new infrastructure for the EVs, new how do you pay for the electricity? Where do you plug in? What happens when employees plug in at home? So there are a lot of really great variables that the fleet managers need to be cognitive of.
Yeah.
And assess as to how they proceed forward, because government legislation is pushing, manufacturers away from internal combustion engines. So the hand of the fleet managers is being forced.
Yeah. Okay. And now, finally, anyone listening to this conversation go, "All right, okay, I want to know more. Chris has said some really interesting things. I want to get some more information." What would you say to them? What's the best thing to do?
Reach out to. For us in particular, at Teletrac Navman, we have an extensive array of specialists. So we're not just an organisation that sells telematics. There is a method behind the madness. So for your specific needs, we often have the right specialists in our employment that can not only help you understand what the technology is, but how it's going to support your organisation.
So important. Chris, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you ever so much for taking the time to speak to me today, and for obviously your ongoing support. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure, and thank you very much.
And that brings us to the end of another episode of Infrastructure Matters. A big thank you to Chris Lecluse for sharing his compelling journey and invaluable insights into the evolving world of telematics and driver safety. To our listeners, thank you for tuning in. We hope today's episode gave you practical strategies and food for thought on how to support safer, smarter fleet operations. Be sure to stay tuned as we continue to bring you conversations that matter. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review Infrastructure Matters on your favorite platform. Follow us on LinkedIn for more updates and exclusive content. I'm David Jenkins signing off and reminding you that in the realm of infrastructure, every detail matters.